To launch the fall program, I'm pleased to welcome back to the Carnegie Council a longtime friend, David Phillips. David will be discussing his book entitled An Uncertain Ally, Turkey Under Erdogan's Dictatorship.
Turkey joined NATO in 1952. It served as the eastern flank of NATO. It was crucial to controlling the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In the 1990s, Turkey helped monitor Saddam Hussein and protect Iraqi Kurds by permitting US warplanes to use its bases. Turkey is a secular Muslim country during that period and acted as a bridge to Central Asia. After 9/11, it was a staging area for coalition forces in Afghanistan and assumed overall command of ISAF. NATO, however, is more than a security alliance. It's a coalition of countries with shared values. Given the trends in Turkey under President Erdoğan, which have made the country Islamist, anti-democratic, and anti-American, Erdogan's support for jihadi groups has rendered Turkey an uncertain ally. If NATO were being established today, Turkey simply would not qualify as a member. I'm sure several of you noted that Turkey announced a contract with Russia to buy $2.6 billion worth of S-400 missiles. Not only does this undermine the interoperability principle of NATO, it raises serious questions about how Turkey would respond in the event of a crisis. If Russia were to take action in Ukraine or against NATO members in Poland or the Baltic states, can Turkey be counted on as a friend, or do we need a more steely-eyed assessment of Turkey and see it as a foe? The Justice and Development Party of Tayyip Erdoğan won a smashing election in 2002. With only 34% of the vote, because of the way Turkey's electoral system is structured, it gained 2/3 of the seats in the Turkish assembly. There were doubts about Erdogan's commitment to secularism and democracy from the beginning, although I was among many who welcomed Erdogan's election as a welcome reprise from the calcified politics of secular parties who had governed Turkey for many years. When he won the mayoral election in 1994, Erdogan declared himself the Imam of Istanbul. He opened his first city council session with a chanting from the Quran, something that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would seriously disapprove of. As mayor, he condemned contraception. He banned the sale of alcohol in public places. He endorsed the renovation of mosques. At a 1998 rally in the village of Siirt, he said, "The mosques are our barracks, the minarets are spears, the faithful are soldiers." He was tried by a court and sentenced to 6 months for inciting social divisions. His democracy credentials are also questionable. After the 2002 election, he famously said, "Democracy is like a streetcar. You get off when you've reached your destination." So in praise of Erdogan, we should be honest about his early successes. When he came into power, there was a lot of uncertainty about how he would comport himself in Turkey and towards the United States. Erdogan reaffirmed his ties to the West by embracing Turkey's EU membership. He committed Turkey to the Copenhagen criteria, which provided a roadmap for Turkey's EU membership involving subordinating the National Security Council to civilian authorities and other rights-based reforms in the EU's acquis communautaire. He also implemented some dramatic economic reforms. In response to the financial crisis of 2001, Erdogan imposed fiscal discipline, he reduced runaway inflation, sky-high interest rates, and he imposed curbs on an overvalued currency. He negotiated a $39.5 billion IMF rescue package. And he used the IMF funds to shrink the pension system and downsize the bloated public sector. The runaway inflation was reduced to 13% in 2004, its lowest level in 30 years. On the diplomatic front, he also undertook secret negotiations with the Kurdistan Workers' Party. These were based in Oslo and aimed at ending Turkey's civil war with its Kurdish citizens, numbering as many as 20 million. The civil war had cost the lives of 40,000 people and led to the displacement of millions over nearly 40 years. So having gotten off to a good start, we can see over the years the increasing Islamism and anti-democratic behavior of Tayyip Erdoğan. I think that 2013 can be looked at as a real turning point in the contemporary political trajectory for Turkey. Having ruled for a decade, single-party power distorted Erdoğan's views about accountability and democratic governance. We see a dramatic backsliding on his performance with human rights. He curtailed freedom of expression, jailing journalists. He refused to reform Article 8 of the Anti-Terror Act and Article 301 of the Penal Code, which were used to prevent Kurds and others from expressing their democratic aspirations. He also waged a systematic attack on Turkey's secular institutions, particularly its judiciary. When the Constitutional Court blocked government actions allowing Islamism and liberalizing the wearing of the hijab at public institutions, Erdoğan announced, "I do not respect and will not obey the court's decision." Sounds familiar. We've heard that from other Western leaders as of late. With the war in Syria escalating and President Obama failing to fulfill his pledge to enforce Syria's use of chemical weapons, Erdoğan took it upon his shoulders to expand support for jihadi groups, Jabhat al-Nusra and Salafist groups such as Ahrar al-Sham, as well as ISIS. There was a jihadi highway that was established with the National Intelligence Agency of Turkey as the primary executor, providing weapons, money, logistics to radicals transiting through Turkey, foreign fighters from around the world going from Urfa to Raqqa. When the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey announced that women shouldn't be seen smiling in public because it was unbecoming, it sounds much more like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, than something you'd expect from a well-placed Turkish politician. That same year in 2013, Turks gathered in Gezi Park in downtown Istanbul to protest plans to turn a park and a green area into a neo-Ottoman style shopping mall. Their movement of self-expression spread across the country, and in 70 cities you saw Turks gathering peacefully to demand environmental rights and human rights. Erdoğan ordered the police in. The police brutality that we saw in Gezi Park included mass arrests and water cannon. The protests in 70 cities were brutally suppressed. We also saw in 2013 corruption scandals revealed. There were wiretaps of Erdoğan's phone calls, and on the 17th of December and on the 23rd of December, revelations about Erdoğan's extensive involvement in corrupt activities. On the 17th of December, there were a series of phone calls between himself and his son, Bilal Erdoğan. And Bilal said in the series of phone calls, "Dad, what am I going to do with the tens of millions of euros in the house?" Well, his older sister was called in. Trucks rolled up to the back of the house, and apparently $1.1 billion in Turkish lira were unloaded from the residence and put into the vehicles. By the end of the day, there was another phone call between Bilal and his dad, Tayyip. "Dad, I still have 35 million euros that I can't get rid of. What should we do?" Well, they kicked up a great idea. Let's buy some luxury villas on the Bosphorus. And sure enough, Erdogan's son-in-law, his name is on the deed for properties that were acquired as a result of this police crackdown. So corruption also became a hallmark of the Erdogan administration with these spectacular revelations at the end of 2013. The other setback that year involved Kurdish issues. Erdogan had produced a democracy package providing additional rights to the Kurds, including Kurdish language education in private schools. Unfortunately, those provisions in the democracy package were never implemented. And as a result of that, the PKK withdrew its unilateral ceasefire on September 5th of 2013, plunging the country back into its civil war, which had been so costly to so many. Of course, the people of Turkey were witnesses to all of this. They were concerned by these negative developments. And when Erdogan called for elections on June 7th of 2015, for the first time since 2002, support for the AKP actually decreased. The AKP only received 40.9% of the vote. And this put a big damper on Erdogan's plans to revise the constitution and establish an executive presidency, abrogating the rule of law and putting himself in a position where he would be untouchable. On July 24th, Erdogan restarted the civil war with the PKK in a cynical ploy to gain nationalist votes. Turkish jets started leaving from Incirlik Air Force Base and attacking PKK bases in northern Iraq. I remember Richard Holbrooke, with whom I worked in the US government, telling me about Slobodan Milosevic, that he would solve a problem by creating a bigger one. Well, it seems as though Tayyip Erdogan took a page from Milosevic's playbook, because he restarted a war that was entirely unnecessary, a war of choice. But it had the desired effect. When there were new elections on November 1, the AKP received 49% of the vote. And with this electoral support, Erdogan took steps to consolidate his power. And as a result of that, things have gone from bad to worse. There was a coup in Turkey on July 15th of 2016. But my question is, was there really a coup? Some people call it a false coup or a controlled coup, which Erdogan organized in order to justify a crackdown on the opposition. The coup was undertaken by Turkey's military. And anyone who's ever interacted with Turkish officers knows that they are brutally efficient. But for some reason, the Turkish military's coup d'etat in July of 2016 was poorly considered and even more badly executed. Erdogan checked out of his hotel in Marmaris an hour before the coup plotters arrived to arrest him. Now, how could that be? Shouldn't they have known his checkout plans? The coup plotters possessed F-16 fighter jets, but they made no effort to intercept or shoot down Erdogan's presidential plane. Members of the Turkish general staff were detained, but was their arrest part of the coup design, or was it intended to prevent them from joining the ranks of the mutineers? The putschists never presented themselves to the public, offering a personality and a platform as an alternative. There is actually a well-developed body of knowledge about how you plan and organize a coup d'etat that exists not only among policymakers, but in academic settings. And the coup plotters seem to have broken every rule. And why did they allow social media to keep functioning? They could have jammed its coverage, but they didn't. It's ironic that Erdogan, from his presidential plane, addressed the nation using FaceTime, which is a form of social media that he vowed to eliminate after the Gezi Park protests, because it had been involved in organizing people in opposition to his rule. There were reports about the Turkish Grand National Assembly being bombed by the coup plotters, but crater analysis suggests that the explosives were actually inside the building rather than from high-impact ordnance dropped by fighter jets. So there are a lot of questions about, was there really a coup? I have never, nor will I this evening, take a position on whether Erdoğan was behind the coup. I think that's probably not the case, but I do think it's quite clear that he was tipped off by a foreign power, probably Russia, or that he learned about the coup. He allowed it to go just far enough in order to justify a crackdown. So the coup allowed Erdoğan to say what he had been thinking all along. He warned, this latest action is an action of treason. They will pay a heavy price for this. This is a favor from God. Why? Because it will allow us to purge the armed forces, which need to be completely cleansed. Well, the coup gave license to Erdoğan to release his inner Stalin. He turned Turkey into a giant gulag. The Turkish government had already put together lists of oppositionists, and the authorities moved immediately. 50,000 people were arrested, 150,000 people were removed from their jobs. These included teachers, judges, police, members of the military. Every university dean, more than 1,500, were forced to resign. And 15,000 educators, especially those in the Kurdish areas of southeastern Turkey, were suspended. People were prevented from leaving the country. No one with an official passport could travel, including friends of mine who I'm still trying to rescue and bring to Colombia. Background checks are underway to investigate ties to Fethullah Gulen, a geriatric preacher in the Poconos whom Erdoğan accused of being a terrorist and responsible for all this trouble. Erdoğan declared a 3-month state of emergency, but after 3 months, things were not returned to normal. The state of emergency was extended once and then once again. Erdoğan wanted to create conditions to legally consolidate his power. So he moved quickly towards a constitutional referendum to legally change the constitution and establish an executive presidency, essentially doing away with the role of the parliament and eliminating all checks and balances in Turkey's governance. There was a referendum that was held on April 15th of 2017. The Yes campaign won 51.3% of the vote. The big question is, why did they only win 51.3% of the vote when it was so clearly a sham election where votes were rigged? International monitors from the OSCE, the Council of Europe, issued scathing reports. The COE said it lacks the legal framework adequate for any democratic referendum. It criticized the use of state resources in support of the Yes campaign, their control of official media. No campaigners were threatened and called terrorist sympathizers. Approximately 500,000 Kurds in the southeast were displaced as a result of the military action taken by Turkey against its Kurdish citizens. And since they had no place to live and no residence, they couldn't register to vote. So at least 500,000 voters were disenfranchised as a result of the electoral procedures. You would think, as a result of this sham election, that the United States government would have joined the world in condemning Turkey's democratic practices. But no, our President Donald Trump was the first to call Tayyip Erdoğan and to congratulate him on his victory. And not only did he offer congratulations, he invited him to come to the White House for an official meeting. Well, he came on May 17th, and in a meeting that only lasted 23 minutes, Erdoğan drew some red lines and made some demands of President Trump. He demanded that the U.S. discontinue its support for the YPG, who are fighters of Kurdish origin in Syria. According to Erdoğan, the YPG and the PKK are one and the same. He wanted the U.S. to back off. He demanded that the U.S. extradite Fethullah Gulen to face terrorism charges in Turkey. So he left that meeting and he went to the Turkish ambassador's residence for a session with prominent Americans, Madeleine Albright, William Cohen, David Petraeus, organized by the Atlantic Council, which, by the way, has received millions of dollars from the Turkish government and Turkish sources, maybe in violation of its 501c3 status. And as Erdoğan pulled up to the ambassador's residence, there was a small group of Yazidi women and Kurds and Armenians protesting outside. Erdoğan's personal security was given an order by Erdoğan to charge the demonstrators, and they were badly beaten. Many of you may have seen a woman in red pants named Lucy Usoyan, a Yazidi who's working for Yazidi rights and to provide services to rape victims, badly brutalized by Erdoğan's personal security. So given this negative trend, how has the US responded? Instead of complying with Erdoğan's demands, the US determined that the YPG was essential to liberating Raqqa, and it expanded its military cooperation with Syrian Kurds fighting against the Islamic State. It expanded cooperation by providing heavy and offensive weapons, and though those weapons were nominally given to the Syrian Democratic Forces, they were in fact given by the US government to the YPG, heroic Kurdish fighters. No action has been taken against Fethullah Gulen, and even if the US does decide to extradite, ultimately the extradition decision has to be reviewed by a US court. One criteria for extradition is that the person can receive a free and fair trial in the country to which he's being extradited. Arrest warrants have been issued by a grand jury for 19 members of Erdoğan's personal security for beating the protesters outside the Turkish ambassador's residence. It seems as though the attitude of the US is shifting. And if the sale of S-400 missiles goes forward as Erdoğan has promised it would, what is the Pentagon thinking about Turkey? Is the State Department so marginalized that it won't have views about Turkey's anti-democratic behavior, about its continuing support and sympathy for Islamists? And having supported Islamic movements in Syria, when Raqqa is defeated, all of those Islamists are going to go back to their base of operations in Turkey, and we're going to see an intensified conflict there. So what should the US do? We're at a critical moment. Everybody who knows me can attest that I'm practical and proactive. So let me put forth some recommendations. The US should intensify its supply of military supplies to the YPG. The area in northern Syria called Rojava, which are the cantons of Afrin, Kobani, and Jazeera, will become contiguous. And the PYD, the political party of the YPG, has proposed a program for decentralizing power from Damascus to its regions. The US should fully support decentralization as a way of fostering democracy and peace and stability in Syria during the transition from Assad's rule to some future governance. The US should delist the PKK as a foreign terrorist organization. I'm not sure they should ever have been put on the FTO list, but surely delisting should be part of an effort to revitalize the peace talks between Ankara and the PKK. There's no military solution to the Kurdish question in Turkey. Right now, there's no US ambassador in Ankara. John Bass finished his tour. He hasn't been replaced. The US should not send an ambassador to Turkey until Turkey shows a genuine commitment to reform. There's also a lot of talk about Turkey's suitability as a NATO member. Well, we have to remember that Turkey is not Erdoğan, that Turkey will exist long after Erdoğan is gone. So I have recommended that NATO set up a compliance review committee. This committee would evaluate the democracy criteria that's been used to admit members and would issue a scorecard on each NATO member state annually, assessing their democratic governance. And if a country like Turkey or Hungary receives a failing grade for 2 years in a row, put them in the penalty box, suspend them. There's no place in the North Atlantic Alliance for tyrants and dictators. So having visited Turkey many times, having many Turkish friends who are suffering hardship, who have lost their jobs, who no longer have newspaper columns or can appear on television, I just feel it's time to stop the happy talk about Turkey as an indispensable NATO member or as a valued secular democracy. We need to face the fact that Turkey under Erdoğan has become a rogue regime. We have to see Turkey as it is, not as it was or how we wish it to be. Turkey used to be an important partner of the United States. Under Erdoğan, it's become an uncertain ally. And now Turkey is a strategic adversary. U.S.-Turkish relations will never be restored as long as Erdoğan lives or stays in power. The U.S. policy should focus on regime change, no more kowtowing to dictatorship.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, for sure.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.